Ron Wiseman couldn't wait to return home to Amy, his beloved wife, with whom he had lived for 11 years. Things went well after her new boss, Mike Armstrong, found out how wrong it was to consider him God's gift to women, regardless of whether she was married or not. From what Amy told me, he started with a clean slate and was a model of professionalism in the office, impressing both subordinates and superiors. But he noticed that her mood had changed in the last couple of months. Finally, the day came when he couldn't stand the mood swings anymore. When he entered the living room, he saw that she was sitting in her armchair with tears in her eyes. He sat down and took her hand. "Okay, Amy, something's wrong." "What's happening?" he asked. She started to wave him off again, but he stopped her. "No, Amy, don't turn me down again," he said softly. "Spit it out. What's bothering you? I'm your husband, and I love you, but I can't help if I don't know what's going on." Amy wiped her tears with a napkin, nodded her head, and looked at her husband. "Is that Mike?" he asked. "Is he bothering you again?" She shook her head. "No. Since that night, Mike has behaved like a true gentleman." "This is his boss, David Hawkins," she said. "Tell me about it," Ron said. "All right," Amy said. "Do you remember how a couple of weeks ago I went out for a drink with the girls?" Ron nodded his head. He remembered that night. Amy didn't go out with the girls very often, but she did that evening, returning around 8:30 a.m. a little tipsy and a little upset. "Well," she added, "David showed up and had a drink with us. He danced with a couple of girls and then came up to me. He invited me to dance, and I agreed, but I was a little embarrassed about it, since he's Mike's boss. He didn't seem to like it very much. He looked into my eyes and said, 'So, I think it would be inappropriate if I used you too.' I was shocked. I told him that it sure as hell wouldn't be appropriate, and I told him that you, my husband, would kill him if he tried." He laughed. "Your husband?" he asked. "You mean that pathetic bean vendor you're married to? Damn it, I've cuckolded a lot of husbands a lot tougher than he has." I couldn't believe he could say that. I told him in no uncertain terms that you are not a weakling. He laughed at that. "We'll see about that," he said. Then he reminded me that my annual review was coming up and suggested that he might be bad if I didn't give him a reason to give me good grades. "Amy, this is harassment," Ron said. "You need to report him to HR first thing in the morning." "That's not all," Amy said. "Today he called me to his office and reminded me about the review again. He told me in no uncertain terms that if I wanted to get a good review, I should let him use me in our bed, and you should watch. He also warned me against contacting the HR department and said he would find a way to get back at me." "Amy, this is already over the line," said Ron. "We need to take action against him, and we need to do it quickly." "Ron, you don't understand," she said. "David has been working for the company since the very beginning. He's a real bossy asshole and thinks he can do whatever he wants without consequences. I've heard from many other girls that he molested them and made their lives unbearable when they contacted the HR department about it." "Did he give you a deadline?" Ron asked. Amy nodded her head. "I have to give him an answer by the end of the day tomorrow," she said. It's Friday, Ron thought. Ron thought about the situation for a few minutes, and a plan began to form in his head. He looked at his pretty wife. "Do you trust me?" he asked. Amy tried to read his expression, but couldn't. However, she knew that he had a devious plan in mind, and she wanted to hear it. "Yes, baby, you know I do," she said. Ron smiled and nodded his head before telling her what he meant. The more he talked, the more Amy's face lit up. "By the way," Ron asked, "is he married?" Amy nodded her head. "Yes," she said. "He is married and has 2 children." "Why did you ask? What do you say if we invite his wife too?" "But we won't tell him," he said. Amy giggled with delight and hugged him. "Oh, baby, you're so vicious," she said. "I like it. Are you going to call her or should I?" "Maybe I should do it," he said. Amy agreed. "So, do we have a deal?" Ron asked. Amy was bouncing up and down, smiling and giggling. "Yes," she exclaimed. "I want you so badly right now," she said. "Let's forget about dinner." The next morning, Ron kissed his wife on his way to work. "Don't forget, invite him tonight. Tell him to be here at 9 o'clock sharp. Don't let him off the hook. Tell him it's either tonight or never," he said. "Okay, baby. I can't wait," she said. "I love you so much," she added, kissing him hard. Ron went to his office and quickly searched for information about David Hawkins. He found out that David had been the subject of several harassment lawsuits, but all had been mysteriously dismissed. He also obtained David's personal information, which indicated that he had been married to Brenda for 15 years. He picked up the phone and called. Hawkins' residence, the woman said after a couple of rings. I'm looking for Mrs. David Hawkins, Ron said. It's me, Brenda replied. Who are you? What do you want? She didn't sound very happy. Mrs. Hawkins, my name is Ron Wiseman. My wife works for your husband at Johnson and Meyer, he said. Brenda sighed. Are you going to tell me that my husband used your wife and you have photos? What is it? She asked. You wouldn't be the first. No, ma'am, said Ron. But your husband is planning to make love to my wife and is threatening her. Has your husband done this before? Yes, she said. I stopped counting how many times my husband's called me. I thought everything was fine with us after the last time, but I don't think so. So, what do you want, Mr. Wiseman? Do you want to use me in revenge or something like that? My wife and I discussed this last night and agreed to get in touch with you. Can you be free tonight? I would have to take the children to their parents, but it's possible, she said. What's on your mind? Ron explained the plan he and Amy had agreed on. Wow, she said, laughing. Remind me never to stand up to you, Mr. Wiseman. Please call me Ron, he said. So, would you like to join us? I absolutely do, she said. I will take the children to my parents, and from there I will take a taxi. That way, David won't have the slightest idea what's going on. What time should I be there? I'd say around 8 or 8:30 p.m., Ron said. That will give you time to get to know my wife and she'll be able to explain more. I'll be there, Ron, Brenda said. And also, thank you. Ron hung up the phone and smiled. I like it when a plan comes together, he thought to himself. Meanwhile, Amy was busy with David's device. She deliberately waited until he was alone in his office before entering and closing the door loudly. He looked up at her with a sneer on his face. So, have you come to your senses? He asked. Amy looked at him defiantly. At my house tonight at 9 p.m. sharp. Not a minute earlier and not a minute later, otherwise everything is canceled, and you will never mention this to me again, she said. Will your husband be there? He asked. He'll be there. We talked last night, and he agreed to be there when you come, she said. All right, David said. Did he agree to watch? Amy smiled. Oh, he's going to take a good look, she said. David smiled. He got up and started to approach her, but she opened the door and prepared to leave. I've found that it's much better when a cuckold weakling agrees to it, David said. Just be there at 9 o'clock in the evening. Don't be late, she said, leaving the office. Mike saw her leaving David's office and wondered what was going on. She looked at him and shook her head. He understood, nodded, and went into his office. After meeting her and Ron, he had a genuine respect for her and realized that they were more than capable of dealing with a jerk like David. He also learned to see his boss in a whole new light, and he didn't like it one bit. If anyone could teach David a lesson, it would be Ron and Amy, he thought. Ron was in his living room that night when he heard the doorbell ring. He looked at his watch. At 9 p.m. sharp, he smiled to himself, then opened the door and saw a slightly larger man standing on the porch. You must be David Hawkins, he said. Please come in. David came in and looked around with a grin on his face. You must be Ron Wiseman, David said. Ron nodded. Where is your wife? Is she here? Yes, she's getting ready to meet you, said Ron. Do you know why I'm here? David grinned. Ron nodded his head again. Yes, I know. There are no secrets between us, he said. Actually, it was my idea to invite you over tonight. I suppose it wouldn't do any good to tell you what you're risking. David shook his head. There's no risk unless you or your wife decide to be stupid, he said. I see, said Ron. In that case, would you like to have a shot of whiskey before it all starts? Of course, David said, looking around the house. I'll drink your drink. Then I'll use your woman and maybe have some more of your booze. Ron turned to his liquor cabinet, grabbed 2 glasses, and poured a shot of whiskey into each. He made sure his back was to David and surreptitiously poured some liquid into David's whiskey. He turned back and handed David his drink. David swirled the whiskey before drinking the whole portion in one big gulp. You've got some good shit in there, David said. Maybe we'll do it every Friday night. He looked around in confusion and then fell to the floor unconscious. He's ready. I could use some help here. Amy and Brenda went up the stairs from the basement, and the 3 of them dragged David's body down. They stripped him and attached him with a flattened eagle to a plastic-covered board. How long will he be out? Brenda asked. Maybe an hour, said Ron. Don't worry. We have time. They waited until David started to come to his senses. Ron grabbed a bucket of ice water and splashed it in David's face. Wake up, said Ron. David shook his head. The icy water woke him up. He assessed his position. What the hell is going on? Stop it, he shouted. Brenda walked up to him and slapped him in the face, leaving a red mark. Shut the fuck up, asshole, she told him. You're finally going to learn a very valuable lesson. David looked at her. What are you doing here? He asked. And why are you dressed like that? He asked. I'm here to help these kind people, and if you're lucky, I might give you a ride home, she said. David looked at Amy. You said we were going to make love tonight, he said. You're going to pay for this. No, you idiot, Amy said. I asked you to come over tonight. I never said I was going to use you. You said your husband was going to watch us, he said. Amy shook her head. No, stupid. I said he would be here and would be watching. I didn't say he was going to watch, she said. That's enough. It's time to put this show on tour. He looked at David. That's what's going to happen. If you want to get out of here, you'll do exactly as I say. Understood? David nodded slowly. Now keep your eyes on the monitors above us, he said, pointing to two large wall monitors. By the way, it's for your own good, Ron added with a mischievous grin. He returned to the set table for the film, which was spread on the floor. He removed the lid, revealing a collection of knives, 2 crossbows, 2 compound bows, several bolts and arrows, and a .45 caliber semi-automatic pistol. David's eyes widened in horror. Ron took a precision measuring instrument and handed it to Brenda along with a notebook. He pulled a quarter out of his pocket and handed it to Brenda. She knew what was expected of her. Ron looked at Amy. I'll let you guess, he said. Brenda tossed a coin in the air. Heads, Amy said as the coin arced back to the ground. She hit and rolled a couple of meters before falling flat on the floor. Showing tails. My choice, said Ron. The girls agreed. He picked up a throwing knife and spoke to David. Stay very still. Don't breathe until I tell you to. He took aim and threw the knife. The blade pierced just to the right of David's throat. He didn't hurt the skin, but he was so close that David felt the cold steel on his neck. Ron quickly grabbed another knife, took aim and threw it too, then immediately threw a third knife. The second knife was stabbed just to the right of David's stomach, and the third was to the right of David's thigh. You can breathe, he said to David, who was shaking with fear. Amy took her place in the queue and picked up her first knife. Hold your breath, asshole, she told him. She took aim and threw her first knife. It hit the left side of David's neck. Her second knife pierced to the left of David's rib cage, and the third hit near David's left knee. Okay, relax, she said. Brenda approached David with a measuring instrument and a tablet in her hands. She measured the distance between the knives and David's skin, noting it in a notebook. Please make them stop, David begged her. Why? We're just getting started, and I really like it, she said with a smile as she left. Ron wins this round, she announced. Damn it, Amy said. Your choice. Ron looked at the table and picked up the crossbow. He grabbed the bolt and loaded the weapon. David shook his head, a startled expression on his face. Brenda was sitting on a chair that stood along the side wall, below the line marked with duct tape on the floor. Please don't do it anymore, he said. Shut up and hold your breath, asshole, said Ron, hoisting the crossbow onto his shoulder. He took a breath, held his breath, and began to pull the trigger, aiming the heavy weapon at his target. He released the bolt and watched as the bolt flew, hitting a target near David's right temple. He reloaded the crossbow and aimed again, this time hitting near David's right hip. The third bolt pierced David right under his right testicle. Relax, said Ron. David looked like he was about to faint. Amy took another crossbow and loaded her first bolt. Instead, Ron released the latch and rotated the entire board 90 degrees, so that David's profile. Ron grabbed another large piece of styrofoam, modified so that it could be attached to the wheel, and pressed it tightly against David's right side. Fixing the extra detail, he looked into David's frightened eyes. You better keep this thing in good shape for us, David, old boy, he said. We wouldn't want to accidentally shoot him, you know? David was visibly trembling and looked at Ron pleadingly. I'm begging you, he said weakly. Please, no more. I've learned my lesson. Ron looked at the two girls. Did you hear that, girls? He asked. David is begging us to stop. No problem, David. This is the final round. If you behave yourself, we can just let you go. Now do as we say, and you can come home safe and sound. And please try not to screw up, okay?" They left, but this time Brenda sat down at the opposite end of the room. "The choice is still yours," Amy said when they returned to the table. Ron took a compound bow and took an arrow out of the quiver on the table. He inserted an arrow, pulled back the string, and took careful aim. "Don't breathe," he told David. He took a breath, held it, and released the arrow. Ron grabbed another arrow and sent it down. It hit right next to the first arrow and was soon followed by the third. Ron sat down on the sofa facing David, and the girls followed his example. Amy looked at Brenda and smiled. "Go on," she said. "You have my permission. You deserve it. Are you sure about this?" he asked. "This was not part of our plan." Amy sat down next to Ron, and Brenda walked over to her husband. "I'm sorry, darling, but Brenda and I came up with this while we were waiting for David, and I didn't have a chance to tell you." "It's all right, really. I'm going to be here with you the whole time," she said. Meanwhile, Brenda began to scold David, who was still in shock from the events of the evening. "Look at me," she said. "When was the last time you touched me, huh? You probably don't even remember." "Well, I remember. It's been 584 days since you last made love to me. Every night I sit at home, crying, hoping and praying that you will finally start to notice me. I begged and begged you to stop, but you didn't want to. I would do anything for you. What would you do if I screwed up with you the way you do? Don't answer, because I already know. You'd kick my ass to the curb and divorce me, and you would have every right to do so. Well, it all ends right here and now. I'm going to use Ron, and you're going to watch," she said. David shook his head, but Brenda stopped him. No. You have no right to complain," she said. "You can cry all you want, but it's going to happen. And I pray to God that he will get me pregnant. And if he does, you will accept the child and raise him as your own. Understood? Did you like it?" "What is it?" she asked him. David shook his head, crying bitterly. "Now you know what it's like, don't you? That's how I've felt for years, knowing that you're making love to one of your office girls. But no more than that. I'm not going to take it away from you anymore." She got off Ron and walked over to David. "That's what you plan to do with them, isn't it?" "What is it?" she asked. David nodded his head, crying. "How does it feel? You don't like it, do you?" He shook his head. She took his head in her hands and looked him straight in the eyes. "Are you ever going to do this to me again?" He shook his head violently. "No," he said. "I'm sorry. Please forgive me," he pleaded. Brenda looked at Ron and Amy. "What do you guys think? Should we forgive him and let him go, or should we do it again?" Ron looked at Amy. "What do you think?" he asked her. Amy looked at David. "Well, what is it?" she asked him. "Should I forgive you? Are you ever going to hit on me or anyone else again? And you're going to hold my review hostage because of this?" "No, Amy, never again. I promise. Please forgive me," he said, sobbing. "All right, David. As for me, it's done," she said. "Thank you," he said softly. Ron got up, put on his shorts again, and walked over to David. He knocked David down and put him on the floor. Now David was sitting on the floor sobbing, and all three of them were looking at him. Ron had planned to finish the punishment by urinating on him, just to finish the lesson, but he didn't see the need for that right now. David was clearly a broken man. He knelt down next to David and lifted his head to look into his eyes. "I never, ever want to hear that you've been chasing other women," he said. "Especially for my wife. You have a damn good woman who, for some reason I don't understand, loves you. From now on, you better respect her. I'll be in touch, and God help you if I hear that you didn't make love to her. Do you understand me?" "I understand," David said. Ron nodded his head and stood up. "Let's take him to the shower and get him cleaned up," he told the girls. They helped David to his feet, and the three of them led David to the basement shower room. Brenda insisted on helping him at this point herself, so Ron and Amy stepped back and hid their weapons. After washing and dressing, David and Brenda returned upstairs, where Ron and Amy were waiting for them. Brenda hugged and kissed them both. "Thank you, guys," she said. "I think he's learned his lesson." "I hope so too," said Ron. Brenda smiled. "And if he screws up again, I'll know where to take him," Brenda said before walking David to their car. The following week, everyone in the office was celebrating David's new attitude. No longer cocky and domineering. He treated everyone with respect, especially Amy. Mike even noticed this and wondered what Ron and Amy had done. However, he decided that he didn't really want to know. David gave Amy an honest review that was just under 100%. This didn't surprise Amy, as no one had ever received a perfect review. Something the company said ensured that everyone would have room to grow. David stopped chasing other women and began counseling his wife on marriage issues, trying to rebuild their marriage. Brenda didn't get pregnant that night, but she already knew about it, secretly using her diaphragm as well as her birth control pills. She decided to keep it a little secret from David, just to keep him on his toes. As Ra might have said, it seemed like a pound of treatment was exactly what the doctor ordered. And